A glittering treasure trove of handyman silver. The all-purpose, ingenious Robertson square head screw.
This invention set the whole idea of screw driving on its ear. As simple as it sounds now, was just phenomenal. And it is, quite frankly, it was genius, pure genius.
I mean, if you put it on, it doesn't fall off. And so the idea that you can now do things with one hand.
It is an unspectacular, everyday occurrence that happens countless times, every minute, everywhere. A screwdriver engaging a screw into a piece of wood. But this mundane, unassuming screw is a testament to one man's vision. A spark of inspiration in the fertile mind of Canadian inventor P.L. Robertson. An amateur engineer who was not attempting to make a bold technological breakthrough, but whose mind was consumed with the modest ambition of bestowing to the world something profoundly more practical. A better screw.
I'm sold. I'm sold on the Robertson. I would rate him the tops of any inventors in Canada that I've run across.
P.L. Robertson was a native of a small town in Ontario. But his legacy, the Robertson screw, has been called the greatest little invention of the 20th century. It all begins with wire. Miles and miles of wire, not molten, not molded, but cold wire that is sliced, pounded, and sculpted into that magnificent tool, the screw. And these miles and miles of wire are turned into billions and billions of screws. So ordinary and so commonplace, yet the machinery needed to make screws is designed with such precision that the screw is accurate to within 1/2000th of an inch. This one factory in Montreal makes 1 billion screws a year for the domestic market. Around the globe, we are talking hundreds of billions of screws. They are everywhere, in our airplanes, in our cars.
The screw is such an ordinary, everyday tool or device in one sense, and the driver a tool, that it's hard to imagine what our world would be like without screws.
There is nothing finer. Well, there were a few other things, but then when you got the torque and then you hear that, oh, that is such a wonderful sound. It really is. And because you know you got a tight grip.
They are in our cradles and in our coffins, and for good reason. They are a reliable, durable fastener.
Well, a screw actually makes a mechanical joint. Since it forces its way between the wood fibers, and each one of these threads is a mechanical connection with the grain.
It goes around and around and around like this, so when you turn the screw, and it's biting its way and it's pulling itself into the wood as you're pushing.
That's why you basically can't pull out a screw without destroying the wood.
Compare that to a smooth round nail that requires only brute force to pound in. But this inferior fastener doesn't lacerate the grain, it merely pushes it aside.
The nail is just bang, it's impact.
Holding power of a screw far, far supersedes the holding power of a nail. You can take a claw of a hammer and simply pull a nail out.
But oddly enough, compared to other ancient tools like the hammer or the saw, the screw is fairly recent.
To understand why we got along without screws for thousands of years, you have to understand that the first nails, and I have one here, these were what nails were like. This is a fairly big one. They were forged by hand, and they were square.
Now, when they went in, they grabbed better than a round nail, you know, because first of all, they were forged and they were rough.
It forces the fibers of the wood apart and sort of squeezes between them. And when you drive a square nail like this into a piece of wood, you can't pull it out. It's just impossible.
In fact, the first screws as fasteners were used in armor because the movement would pull nails apart. Making them was toilsome and demanded inordinate patience.
You basically took a steel or wrought iron in the 16th century dowel and filed it. And you filed it by hand. So in the case of the armor was fantastically expensive. It was the highest technology of the time. And so you could afford to have somebody spend, a month filing a screw. And those screws are perfect. They look like machine screws. They're just beautiful.
It wasn't until the invention of the butt hinge in the 17th century that machine-made screws became a necessity. The nails would eventually be wrenched out of the door.
And it was the Wyatt brothers in England who invented a process for mass-producing wood screws, which is very interesting because it's also, in fact, the first example of automated mass production. The tools used human power. They were various little lathes and things. People would turn them, but essentially there was no skill required. The skill was in the machine. And this was one of the first examples, as far as we know, of this kind of mass production where the machine, rather than the craftsman, has the skill.
For over a century, the screw was a noble piece of scientific enterprise, but with a woefully annoying flaw. It had a slot head, graceful in its minimalism, but an impractical pain.
It's very, very easy for that screwdriver to slip out of the slot, either out the side or twist out the other direction. It's called in the trade cam out. And if your screwdriver does that, at the moment that you're heaving on it, putting some real pressure on it, then you either damage the work piece, say what might have been a beautiful casket or a piece of fine furniture, you damage that, or if your hand is nearby because you've been holding the screw, you can injure yourself.
And so, at the dawn of the 20th century, enters P.L. Robertson with a blueprint to perfect the majestic screw, eliminate its vexing faults, and fashion a head that will make the slotted screw a vestige of antiquated engineering. Screw humbly begins in the agricultural heartland of southwestern Ontario at the latter end of the 19th century on a farm near the small town of Canfield. P.L. Robertson is one of 3 brothers raised by his mother. His father dies at an early age. Like most farms, equipment is always in need of repair, and as a teenager, P.L. had a proclivity to dabble in the farm's workshop.
He obviously had a mechanical mind. He was obviously a tinkerer, somebody who liked playing around with things and thinking of solving things.
And when he enters his workshop, his inventive spirit captivates him.
P.L. was tinkering in this shop all the time, making things, trying to develop things. He is even reputed to have done that classic case of designing a better mousetrap.
A mousetrap that supposedly could catch 4 mice. However, nobody is beating a path to his door. After a stint in business school, the young P.L. feels he has the salesman's touch, and along with his penchant for mechanical devices, becomes the Canadian agent for a popular tool, the Johnson wrench brace.
In its normal position, it would be like any other kind of brace. You could insert an auger bit in the jaws up here and use it as a brace to bore holes. But it would do other things as well. For example, if I pull the handle off, then I have a little blade screwdriver for inserting or removing slot screws. If I change the position of the handle a little bit, then I have given myself a wrench with 2 kinds of jaws. P.L. Robertson promoted this as if it was the greatest tool that the world had ever seen.
P.L. has the gift of hyperbole and self-promotion. He sells the tool in Canada as the Robertson brace. In his literature, he calls it the greatest tool on earth. Bright men have spent their lives in an effort to invent just what we have. It is worth its weight in silver to any man. Don't miss this chance. Get one now. But P.L. is not content with selling other people's wares. He wants to reap the benefits of owning his own patent.
I was reviewing a book published in the United States about patented braces of one kind or another that had been developed and invented in the United States. And lo and behold, about 10 or 12 pages past the Johnson patent for a combination tool wrench brace, there was an unknown previously patent issued to P.L. Robertson for that kind of device.
But still, not even one lowly sunken footprint on the pathway to his door. Undeterred, PL soldiers on. He's convinced that what the world is waiting for is a better corkscrew, even though there are hundreds on the market.
That was a peak period. Late 19th century into the early 20th was a huge number of patents. There was a market there, but you have to make something that's acceptable and easy to use and cheaper to manufacture. And perhaps his model he patented in 1905 wasn't that.
PL's foray into the cutthroat world of corkscrew patents is a dismal failure. His design is supposed to lift out the cork by simply pushing down on the handle.
I really don't understand, and I've written a lot on patents. I don't understand the text. Believe me, I know a lot about corkscrews.
PL's attempt to design a get-rich-quick invention is floundering. So he furiously goes back on the road again to pursue his talent as an itinerant salesman, a one-man infomercial peddling another tool that once again no craftsman could afford to be without, the Yankee screwdriver.
It's a screwdriver that will operate with a ratchet motion. It also will operate on a push-pull system. Namely, if you do this, it will turn the screw, and so you can get a lot of pressure on driving a screw in with that pressure motion rather than just turning it with your wrist.
He set up a pitch on Craig Street in Montreal to sell these on the street corner, to sell the Yankee screwdriver line, which was a pretty good line. And for a young man trying to make a buck, he set these things up in various fairs, exhibitions, and street corners.
This device, while it's very, very helpful and handy, can be kind of vicious. If I turn this little knob the wrong way, it goes off like a gun.
He was pumping the thing up and down, and the spring came undone out of this, and it cut him right here, between the forefinger and the thumb.
What's called chisel point of the classic screwdriver slipped, cut his hand very, very badly.
And he quit for the day, and he started to ruminate about why that thing slipped out of there and so on. And he got the idea of trying for a slot or a socket in the head that wouldn't slip. And that's when he invented the Robertson socket.
Once again, he ships off a drawing of his latest contraption to the patent office. And in his penchant for hyperbole, he claims that now Canada has brought out the greatest improvement in the screw in recorded history, and ranks his invention as the perfection of the concept that the Greek scientist Archimedes developed. This time, swaggering claims are not merely a pitchman's bravado.
The secure fastening was the portion of the recess in the screw that has very slightly tapered sides to it.
Now, when you put the Robertson on here, look, and I'll even be so bold as to try this. Now, to me, that's amazing.
That means that you can hold the screw and the driver in one hand while you're holding something else with the other hand while you start driving the screw.
I could be screwing that screw in up there, and I could be rooting through my toolbox trying to get something else that I might need.
But for any inventor, design is one thing, getting investors is another. He approaches Hamilton and Niagara Falls, and their offers are discouraging. But he soon finds apostles in the bucolic town of Milton, about 25 miles from Toronto. Milton is trying to find a way to transform itself from a farm community into the industrialized 20th century, and makes PL an offer he can't refuse. Low-cost land, access to a railway, and a tax-free loan of $10,000. The town is gambling on a traveling salesman with no experience in business who has invented a contraption that nobody knows will have the slightest sales potential.
He had an idea that was unproven and sort of outlandish. I mean, a new type of screw that nobody's using and they're going to change. So I think it was quite adventurous for the town, for what they did.
Now for PL, the formidable task begins, making the machinery that can make these screws cheaply. If he succeeds, he will be Milton's favorite adopted son. If not, he will be chased out of town. And he proves he is as gifted a mechanical engineer as he is an inventor. The process he introduces to manufacture the screw is the double blow.
And you cut a piece of wire and it goes into a die, and the first blow starts to form the head, just with a little swelling on the top. And the second one comes and puts the head on it. It flattens it with the second punch.
Not only is he successful, but he can also manufacture the socket head screw cheaper than the slot.
It is cheaper to make because you don't have to saw. Sawing a slot is a separate operation. And you can know you got to load it in a machine. You got to have a saw go through them this way. And it was a tremendous saving.
The first workmen to jump on the Robertson bandwagon are electricians.
When the electrician was wiring the house, he had to hold this, make sure that the wire was in the right position, and then try and start his screwdriver into a slotted screw. And that was holding about 3 things and trying to start a screw at the same time. When the Robertson screw came along, the electrician could put the screw on the screwdriver, and since he was working up horizontally like this, he had his other hand free to hold the knobs, the porcelain knobs, to hold the wire and keep it in place.
Casket makers, boat builders, and furniture makers all sing the praises of the Robertson.
He started giving samples out to the furniture industry in Canada. I mean, it just grew in leaps and bounds instantly because it was so much more efficient on the assembly lines. I mean, the feedback that he received from the factory workers was just astounding.
In spite of the fact that PL produces these screws cheaper, he charges a hefty premium for them.
He felt that it had an advantage and that it would be just fall. You'd be giving money away to reduce it to the price of the lowly slots, and too many people can make the slot. And so he maintained, he and my father, who was his advisor on sales matter, kept a premium at all times for the socket head screw.
Robertson is so confident in his product that he often prices them 75% higher than the slots.
He did it, of course, because he's a businessman. If there was an opportunity to make money, he followed up on it. But the reason that he could charge more and people were happy to buy it was because of the advantages his screw system offered.
Robertson becomes the biggest employer in town, and his reputation is unassailable.
He's practically a saint, actually, because, among other things, he would talk to anybody on the street, and you know, he'd be going up Martin Street, and the high school was on Martin Street in his early years, and he'd say hello to the kids. And somebody said to me when I was interviewing, said, you know, it was not everybody that would talk to a farm kid on the street. So, you know, he had a good feeling for people.
But there's trouble brewing in steel country. Robertson's screws are grabbing market share from his competitor, the Canada Screw Company of nearby Dundas, Ontario. The president of the company accuses Robertson of pumping up his profits and swindling the shareholders. Robertson also finds himself under attack from the weekly publication Saturday Night. A reporter claims that Robertson's patent is fraudulent and that he had duped the gullible townsfolk of Milton into financing him. The Milton newspaper carries a front-page editorial defending their local hero, calling the attacks scurrilous.
The townspeople were rather upset that anyone would treat their business and their P.L. Robertson this way.
P.L. goes on the counterattack. He takes out a full-page ad in the Toronto Globe with an illustration of his patent, proving that it is legitimate. He defiantly declares in the ad that this is the screw the public wants and is going to get. P.L. is also suspicious that the timing of the article is a little too coincidental and that the story must have been fed to the reporter by his rivals at the Canada Screw Company. P.L. is exonerated, and so is his patent.
By the way, the Saturday Night never, ever published another word on the subject.
With his Canadian competition put in its place, he now can realize his loftier ambitions for the Robertson screw to travel overseas to England, Germany, and Russia. He is not going to be content being a big man in a small town.
In his own mind, he was a world-class figure, and I think he set out to be a world power in the screw business.
P.L.'s meteoric success soon turns into a disquieting debacle, conquering the world with his screws. So he decides to go to the industrial heartland of England, a place called Gillingham, where he could produce the screws for the European market. His venture begins with great optimism. There are front-page ads in the daily newspapers proclaiming it the 100% efficiency screw. But P.L. has the misfortune to try to start a screw business on the eve of the greatest conflict in the history of the world, the Great War. And P.L.'s dream of global domination suffers a serious setback when one of the countries with the greatest sales potential turns into an enemy, and the other has more urgent matters to attend to.
His whole plan of selling to Germany and Russia, the Russian Revolution also broke out. So his two big sort of markets kind of collapsed, and he found himself essentially caught up in the war effort.
So much of the plant is converted to making munitions, which is not bad for business. But war is not the ideal time for persuading the world that a new screw can dramatically change the average person's life. Before returning to Milton, he has the audacity to present the British war strategists with an innovative approach for winning the air war against Germany.
If they could add light tracers to anti-aircraft bullets, it would be easier for anti-aircraft gunners to see enemy aircraft, whether they were airplanes or Zeppelins, and shoot them down. And we, of course, know that that didn't occur at the time, but tracer bullets were used in the Second World War. This was just one of his many little ideas.
During the war, he commutes back to his recently purchased magnificent stone house in Milton, where in his late 30s, he is still the most eligible bachelor in town. But P.L. has contempt for marriage and says, how could anyone be so foolish enough to get married? When you get to the stage of holding hands, you're starting to lose your grip. Although, while in England, a photo of him with an attractive young woman arouses suspicion that he had a brief interlude there. And he does have a dalliance with his housekeeper in his home that ends up with her becoming pregnant. It is so hush-hush that the whole incident is shrouded in secrecy.
And she left and went to Toronto. People could hardly believe that this woman, the daughter, existed. And somebody said to me, oh, he couldn't have a daughter. My father would have been told because his her father was well known to PL.
He kept it a secret, except for the fact that he sent her regular money. And this is how I discovered it, in searching through some of his papers.
For dime store psychologists, PL's reluctance to marry may have to do with his excessive feelings toward his mother, who died back in 1908.
In some ways, he was like in Mackenzie King. He had tremendous attachment to his mother, and he was also as a spiritualist too.
He would contact mediums in hopes that he could reach his long-dead mother through a medium. There was an element of the mystic about him.
He prefers the company of men to wooing ladies, and can often be found at the local parlor, partaking a little too liberally.
And he'd get into some pretty loud arguments at times, and on one occasion even fired a guy as a result of drinking bouts. Somebody he'd known for a long, long time, so it was pretty sad, really.
When the war ends, PL hopes that his British plant can concentrate on peacetime production, and that his screw, relegated to oblivion for the last 4 years, can now catapult itself onto the global market. But PL turns out to be a bit of a trusting Pollyanna when dealing with his British partners. There is a hostile takeover by the British Board of Directors. PL's attempt to be the gold standard in the screw business is shattered.
He lost money, some of his friends lost money, and the business went down the drain and was closed in the mid-1920s in England. And the story has it that P.L. Robertson was so upset by that he really, in a sense, withdrew inside himself.
In spite of his financial setbacks, there is no stopping his inventive mind. These cufflinks are another Robertson original.
No one had one that looked at all like this before. He had them manufactured in 18-karat gold, and he gave them, he not only wore them himself all the time, but he gave pairs of these to major customers and personal friends.
And then there is the Robertson screw tie clip, and a shoehorn that makes removing galoshes from shoes less cumbersome. In the mid-20s, a huge break for PL, a golden moment to showcase his screw on the world stage. Henry Ford, the daunting merchant prince of the horseless carriage, introduces socket heads to his assembly line.
The socket head screw, when they put them into the Model T, saved them 2.5 hours per car from the old slots.
But Ford is uncomfortable being beholden to PL to produce the screws, and wants PL to license his patent or become partners.
Ford essentially wanted to buy him out. And Ford, of course, was a similar type of person. He wanted to control everything. He didn't want to have subcontractors who were, that he would be beholden to, because that means that he would be at their mercy if they wanted to change the price or whatever. So his theory was that everything would be in, Ford would produce everything, sort of from the beginning to the end.
But after PL's debacle in England, he is not willing to relinquish control. Not to Ford, not to anybody, even if it costs him millions. Even if it means the Robertson screw would never cross the US border.
And he wouldn't give that up. He never did give it up. He would not permit anybody else to make it. He wouldn't have minded being bigger, but he wanted it on his terms. And he couldn't see his terms coming out of the Ford Motor Company, or for that matter, anyone.
He felt he would not be master of his own destiny with Ford. That's what I think.
But being the master of his own destiny means being shut out of the lucrative US market. Meanwhile, an American rival, Henry Phillips, will invent a screw vastly inferior, but that screw will conquer the world. is the spirit of the country, PL turns his inventive mind to finding a cure for the devastating economic woes. PL is persuaded no problem is too large or too small that his mind can't handle. His cure? A worldwide gold-based currency.
He wrote a book titled The Remedy, in which he laid out in writing, in a good-sized book, what he believed to be the way out of the world depression.
He made arrangements so that everybody, all kings and heads of government throughout the world, would get this book at the same time. He actually got letters, one from Roosevelt saying, "Hey, thanks for the book." It was, but that's what he saw himself as a world citizen.
A Toronto paper finds his ideas provoking, but his unorthodox idea for a universal currency is overly ambitious, even for the self-assured PL. On a more temporal plane, during the Depression, he becomes famous for his benevolent Halloween handouts, which are appreciated by the trick-and-treaters.
The kids all went to his place because he was very generous. And he usually gave them nickels or dimes, and not candy. And they would all go there. The whole town would wind up on his doorstep.
PL never strays far from his compulsion to perfect his screw. Deep in the recesses of his soul, PL is a screw-driving man. One ingenious innovation is designing a cheaper screwdriver. And the surprise is, the cheaper screwdriver is fabricated from two separate pieces of steel.
This is just a piece of cold roll steel with a hole drilled in it. And this is a piece of tool steel, or a higher carbon steel, that's headed into the shape of the square in the socket. And it's just inserted down in here that far. And you can pull this out and replace it. So that this was the cheap. We gave these screwdrivers away.
So if you had to build the whole screwdriver out of this material that the tip was made out of, it would have been very costly. And that's the way that we make the screwdrivers today.
After perfecting the screwdriver, PL is confident he can turn Canada into Robertson country. He recruits a very dedicated sales staff who share PL's evangelical zeal.
He was a fantastic salesman. I mean, he knew how to sell, he knew how to go about selling, and he put a lot of money and effort into selling. So he had a structure, you know, coast to coast of salespeople, and that's how he took it to market.
I could prove with a demonstration that I could save them about 20 to 25% of time of driving his screws. They couldn't believe I was so dedicated to them. He said, "You must eat and sleep screws." I said, "I do. Because I don't understand anybody not using them." I'd come up against a customer that wouldn't buy them. And I'd say, "Why wouldn't you buy them?" So he'd give me all the excuses he could, and I said, "I still don't understand you." To me, it's irrational. I guess they thought I was irrational, but it's not me. I know what it's like to drive a slot screw.
But while PL is locking up the Canadian market, south of the border a new screw is making another assault on the lowly slot head. The Phillips, a recessed screw with a cruciform head. And another eccentric traveling salesman seeks immortality in the screw world, Henry Phillips, and he didn't even invent his screw.
Phillips bought the patent, modified it slightly, kind of came up with this sort of cruciform shape, which is the Phillips head. And the big difference was that he didn't have capital and he wasn't a manufacturer, and he was simply trying to license his ideas to the big screw manufacturers who were mostly in Connecticut at that time. And so he spent about, I think, 10 or 15 years trying to convince people. He basically couldn't convince anybody to try it.
Finally, a break for the persistent but enigmatic Phillips. GM tests it on their 1936 Cadillac.
It was a great success, and this was just before the Second World War. So that essentially, while Robertson was unlucky with the war, the Phillips got very lucky because they moved into really big production, and the Phillips screw came along just at the time of the Second World War and became the kind of standard fixing device really everywhere, both for electrical things, mechanical, wood screws, I mean, across the board.
As a result, the market became saturated with Phillips screws. Robertson's opted to strictly maintain the manufacturing in-house and not license out the patent, and as a result, they were unable to overcome this mass production of the Phillips screw.
They don't use Robertson. It's not that widely used in the States, the Robertson. Everything is Phillips.
Why is that?
Because they didn't invent it. Because the Americans, of which I am one, they didn't invent the Robertson. So they say, we won't use that, we can't put our name on it. So we use the Phillips.
In Canada, Henry Phillips becomes the Darth Vader of screws, and the Phillips screw an object of derision. The Phillips just doesn't cling like the faithful Robertson.
This is a Phillips. You put that on, and I can hold it up. Now, if I have to make, if I'm going to go in, oh, it fell off.
You have to apply so much downward pressure that some people just can't put enough pressure on it, and what happens is a screwdriver skips. And that's how you start to ream out the recesses.
Reaming out the recesses is just a technical way of saying massacring the head of the screw.
It's having a tendency to slide out, to cam out. That's about as far as I can drive it. It's slipping out now.
Do you ever use the Phillips?
I've never used them.
You just have them as a...
I have them because my car's full of them.
You would never buy a... If you had to use...
I never use one. It's just a nightmare trying to get them to stick on and drive them, or you've got to put a lot of torque on them. If you're doing any amount of work with a screw, you want a socket head.
PL had conquered Canada, but his vision of a world dominated by Robertson socket heads is still a pipe dream. In spite of the Phillips' success south of the border, PL also thrives during the war. His company supplies screws for airplanes and naval escort boats, and the Robertson screw becomes a Canadian landmark. But PL is growing old, and his health begins to fail. Loneliness sets in. When his faithful companion, his Pekingese, dies, he is heartbroken. He holds a formal funeral and buries him in a cloth-lined casket. Soon after, PL's mind starts to deteriorate.
He was in his home here in Margaret Street, and one day, one of his employees was fixing the windows in the home, and PL was inside and said to this guy, "I'm a prisoner in my own house." So he had, for the last 4 or 5 years, he was very, very incompetent, and he escaped from his house here and walked down Martin Street, and two of the people who were caring for him had to rush out and get him and bring him back, and that's pretty tough for a guy who was a king of the town to end up that way. It's pretty tragic.
He spends a year in a psychiatric institution where he is convinced that some of his employees who had tried to start a union are conspiring to kill him. He believes the birds are giving him special warnings. He dies in 1951, a local hero. But in the world market, his screw doesn't even make a blip. PL's vision of a world where the Robertson is supreme may finally be realized as the Robertson screw is on a journey to China. Produce 1 billion screws a year. The headquarters is still in Milton, as is a huge distribution plant. The company has plans to expand into China on a massive scale.
We have 5 acres of property, which allows us to expand up to 150,000 square feet. So that has the potential to build billions of fasteners.
Meanwhile, in Milton, the home of the Robertson, Precision Fasteners, a rival company, is producing socket head screws for the domestic market. What would PL think of this ironic twist? His company going global and a rival making screws in Milton. He's probably smiling that his vision of global supremacy may soon be realized, and also pleased that the town that gave him his big break is still cranking out socket heads. As for the Robertson screw, for the handyman, the craftsman, and the factory worker, it will always be a masterful piece of elegant engineering, a testament to sublime simplicity, a thing of majestic and mechanical beauty, poetry in cold steel.
It works. I wouldn't screw you. It works. I wouldn't screw you.